think that is the root cause of a lot of this is people do not trust the equipment. It's not that they're calling people cheaters. I think it's that you can't trust that performance. It was done on that trainer or it was done on that power meter. That can't be right. And until you get away from that, I don't think we're ever going to be able to just trust a performance on face value with little to no context.
Hello and welcome to episode 67 of the Virtual Velo Podcast with me, Emma Martin, and my co-host, Chris Schwenker. Well, the Virtual Velo Podcast, the show that bridges the gap between the athlete and avatar, keeping it real in the world of cycling esports. Today on the show, we have Dean Cunningham. Dean, a passionate and outspoken voice in cycling esports, an elite racer for Restart, powered by Alex Coh Coaching. Dean has put his time and energy where his mouth is to move the sport forward, stepping into event organisation and advocacy, launching the Restart Invitational Elite Series and helping to form a cycling esports riders union. In this episode, we discuss his vision for the sport, along with hot topics like the weigh-in procedures, esports athletes putting up world tour level numbers, and the ongoing debate over performance verification.
I'm really looking forward to speaking with Dean. It's the first time that we actually met sort of in person, but I've had countless conversations with him. And I can always count on the fact that he's going to give me a sincere, no-nonsense, straight answer. Sometimes those answers challenge the popular sentiment, but they always come from a place of passion and genuine desire to see cycling esports thrive. In a community where there are plenty of people that are outspoken, sometimes even toxic, without contributing to meaningful progress, Dean isn't one of those people.
Well, Dean, thank you so much for joining us today. Let's start the way we always do on the Virtual Velo Podcast with our racer guests. What's your cycling esports origin story? What brought you, Dean, to cycling esports?
First of all, thanks for having me. That was all really nice things you said about me, and I massively appreciate that. So thank you very much. As for when I got involved with esports, I got involved in a time when the term esports probably really couldn't have been the term to what we're doing now. It was more so people were kind of making up a system for racing on Zwift, just meeting up together to do impromptu races on the platform. So it's come a long way since then. It must have been around 2016. I mostly got involved with it because of where I live in the north of Scotland. The weather is so bad. Training through the winter, I'd done a few winters of training right outside the whole winter, and it was just getting unbearable. So I found myself kind of liking that I could do it from inside and still get the hours in on my bike, and it could complement my training for racing outdoors. So yeah, it was around 2016 that I got into it, so quite early on. But for the most part, I was on it just doing training. I wasn't actually racing on it for quite a while after first getting on Zwift. So, but yeah, that's how I ended up on Zwift in the first place, to avoid the weather.
I'm not surprised. If most people don't know, and I am going to say this, Dean's just told me he lived very far north in Scotland. And just to put it into perspective, Scotland is around a third of the UK land area, which I think a lot of people don't really realise how big Scotland is. It's a long way north.
Yeah, we're absolutely massive.
Yeah, yes. And I think that is something from a geography perspective most people don't realise. Dean, you are an outspoken leader in the community and you do have strong opinions about the aspects of the sport that matter to you. Do you think that, I know Chris opened with that phrase, does that describe you?
It's probably something that my teammates will laugh at, and it's something I kind of laughed at as well. But I suppose when you put it in the context of the time I spend and my involvement in it, then as much as I kind of don't really like fancy titles and being, I don't know, I don't take compliments and things such like that is very well. But yeah, in context, it does make sense. And I think it's a good way of describing kind of what I do.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? You know, you sort of came into Zwift in 2016 because of bad weather and difficult winter training. Why do you think now in 2025 you have such a passion and you're known for that passion for the sport?
I think for me, the big thing about it is we can compete with people all around the world. I can race against guys in Japan, New Zealand, a lot of friends in Canada, America. We can all jump on around our kids, around our work schedules, and we can all race and have fun together. So it's kind of grown from that community social aspect to what I see as can be a competitive and legitimate sport. And I just like to try and push that along and kind of help that happen. So to me, it's kind of grown from that social aspect into a more serious sport, and I can see the potential for it.
And that growth, Dean, has also taken you from being an elite racer to taking on the demands of team management and event organisation. What inspired you to step into that time and energy consuming element of not just racing, but also, managing and running a team and putting on elite level events?
I just thought that we never really had anything team focused anymore. We've got a lot of guys racing on Whoosh. There's not really any sort of team focus, team capability in Whoosh, in my opinion. And with the Zwift World Series, we do have a team competition as such in there, but it's all so much focused on the individual now and creating individual esports superstars. But I think a lot of our sport here that we have was founded on teams and communities. You can look right through Zwift and the massive communities of people that were pulled in together to create these. And I think the virtual cycle essentially built itself upon these. So for me, seeing the teams, large teams and large communities kind of be forgotten at the top level of the sport was my main driver to say, well, no one else is doing an elite level series for teams. So instead of sitting moaning about it, let's just go and do it.
And I love that proactivity. And we're going to talk a little bit more, Dean, about Restart, the Invitational Elite Series. But just before we do, it is perfect timing having you join us here. It is the 27th of February, if anybody's wondering what day we're recording this, because the Zwift Elite Racing is back at the beginning of March. The Zwift Elite Championships, the game, 5 stages, 2 sprint stages, 2 climb stages, and an epic stage over 3 Saturdays in March, the 8th, the 15th, the 22nd, broadcast on GCN. The first stage, the sprinters stage, 2 races, stage 1 and stage 2, and then the top 5 from those 2 races go forward to the sprint showdown, where we crown the winner of the Zwift Games Sprint Championships. Very similar structure in the climbing, 2 stages, then the top 5 go through to the climb showdown, and then the final stage 5, Epic Queens stage for the Epic Championships. And then on top of that, there is the overall championships for racers who have raced all 5 stages, with prize money down to 30th place. It's a big undertaking, but it is back and it is scheduled now for March. Are you excited, Dean, to have elite racing back from Zwift after that several-month hiatus and pause?
Yeah, definitely. It's felt like the weirdest winter of them all in recent times because we've not had much elite racing on Zwift. So no, I'm really happy to see it back and getting into swing and see people getting excited about it, and to see people, my teammates, all getting geared up and ready for it. So it's good to see it back, absolutely.
What do you think of the format and the other aspects of the Zwift Games for 2025?
I was a big fan of the format last year. It was new last year, and I really enjoyed it. I thought the production of it, the broadcast production, the branding of it, I did think it was a big step up for Zwift, and I thought it was really good. So I'm glad to see it return and maintain all the stuff it did from last year. The epic stage should be a bit longer, in my opinion. We have enough 40 and 50k races on Zwift. Could do with a 70 or 80k race. And like you've seen in our series, that was a big part of it, longer races. And it's a kind of complaint I see from a lot of guys is, we want to have a big long race. So this is our one chance to have one at the elite level with a proper Zwift production broadcast. I just thought a 70 or 80k race would have been nice to have as epic. But as for the rest of it, I think it's a really good format. It's a good mixture, and it'll get to showcase people's talents really well in the different kind of races. So no, I think they're doing a good job with it.
Yeah, I agree with you, Dean. It would have been nice to have an actual epic race. I know that last year that was one of the best races in my opinion. I do like the fact that having the 2 races filter into what is essentially a tiny race, and we all know how popular that format has been. So it's going to be really interesting to see, and the fact that GCN is going to be broadcasting it, we know that they'll do a good job with it. That kind of brings us to the major topic of discussion, which is your Restart Invitational Elite Series, obviously that you organized, and it filled a huge void because there wasn't any racing on the platform after Zwift paused the World Series. So before we get into that, I would like to get your opinion on Zwift's decision to pause the World Series. And if anybody who isn't aware of the whole, that what happened back in December when Zwift decided to put a halt to Zwift World Series. Aaron Burrell and I broke it down during episode 60 of the podcast, if anyone wants to go back and listen to what Zwift, Wahoo, and the other stakeholders had to say. But what are your thoughts on Zwift stepping away from elite racing for several months?
Ultimately, at the time, it felt kind of harsh and it felt a bit knee-jerk. But now, in hindsight and looking at it, I think it was the right decision. And that's based on, first, that my knowledge of the hardware is pretty extensive because I spent so much years looking at it and using it. And also because of my experience with our race series just past, where I've personally had to notify riders that we're annulling their result from the race. And to put that into context, we've not annulled a single rider through bad actor or trying to cheat or anything like that at all. I'm having to annul people that are, as far as they're concerned, they've not done anything wrong, but the hardware has let them down. So I absolutely sympathise with the verification side of what happened in ZWS, in that they felt like they were having to annul riders who were calibrating their equipment, they were complete legit athletes, they were doing nothing wrong, and they're having to tell these people that they're annulled from the results through kind of no action of their own at times. Not all the annulments were because of that, but some of them were. And I see the point there. Why should the athlete take the fall for the failings of the equipment? So I think the pause was necessary. And it's kind of a 50-50 split from what I've seen. People thinking they should have kept going or pause. But I'm more on this side of the fence that is in agreement with the pause. It allowed the manufacturers to try and get things in check, and it allowed potentially less athletes to take the fall for things that weren't their fault, and they shouldn't really be taking bad negativity towards their reputation for things that were kind of out of their control with the hardware.
Yeah, I certainly agree. And I know that you have been in and out of hardware scene and, have a very deep knowledge of it. Are you confident that those issues are solved now as we go forward to the Zwift games?
No. I think firmware updates are not what are going to solve the problems with the hardware that we're having to use. So I'm absolutely not convinced that the firmware updates that we've had are actually alleviating all these issues that we're seeing with the trainers and the smart bikes at all. I've experienced it firsthand. I've been sending a lot of data to Elite. It's an Elite Justo 2 trainer that I have, and I've been sending a lot of data back and speaking to Elite on this. And essentially, the firmware updates they're pushing out aren't changing the mechanics, or the mechanical workings of these trainers or the way they could do a lot of things. So I'm not convinced that the updates that we've had pushed out are going to make that much of a difference. If it makes enough of a difference that we stop seeing people getting annulled for things that are not out of their control, then it's still a positive step. It was still a step that needed to happen, and we needed to get back to racing, in my opinion. So it's not going to fix the problems, but it's still a necessary step to get in there.
What would fix the problems?
I am ultimately believing that we potentially cannot do it on the current hardware due to the way they measure power. I think the ultimate solution is that we have a new hardware. I'm not going to say a new trainer or a new power meter, because I think it could be done by either means, but we have to go down the route of addressing the way that the trainers are. A power meter measures the power for indoors, and we have to address the way that communicates that data to the platforms. A big part of the issue we have now is we're not transmitting enough data to the platforms from the power sources, and that data is not encrypted in any way. So it's open to all sorts and all manners of bad actor or man-in-the-middle type attacks, data stream intervention, things like that. There's just too many variables that could be manipulated and bad actors could influence for the current hardware to be viable. So I'm of the opinion that it's new hardware and new communication protocols we need in order to advance the sport.
So, Dean, we're just talking elite level cycling esports, aren't we? We're not, or are we not? Are we proposing then actually that there should be this type of development work for all cycling esports, or really just for elite level racing?
I think in terms of the hardware, this is absolutely necessary for elite. But I think going forward, off the back of that development from a potential manufacturer, the protocols that we use could extend out to all hardware going forward, to almost form an industry standard for better communication protocols between trainers. And that could be applied to all devices that we're using to report power to these games. It doesn't necessarily or strictly need to be just at the elite level. I think at all levels, if you're on there competing, whether it's in C category up to the A plus category, even in ZRL or Sunday Race Club or any of these races, everyone's entitled to have a fair, legitimate race and know that people there that are racing with them are on accurate equipment that's to a good standard. So yeah, I think some of these things we could go super strict with the elite side of stuff because accuracy truly matters there. But filtering down, I think at all levels there is some elements of it that could benefit virtual cycling in general across the board.
So one of the actual very positive byproducts of this, in my opinion, is that the rule set was addressed and there were changes made that are much more rider friendly. And one of those is addressing what you had said, is that a lot of these annulments were not due to rider error necessarily, it was hardware error. So I certainly think that was a very positive consequence of what happened. But would you say, in your opinion, after telling me that you don't think the firmware, solved the problem, that the pause actually achieved the goals that Zwift wanted it to achieve?
So are you asking me if I think Zwift, I think they agree that the pause helped them? Sorry, can you just ask it again? I'm not really sure.
Or, yeah, okay. So maybe I should rephrase that. You shouldn't be speaking on behalf of Zwift. But do you think that the pause achieved the goals that it intended to achieve?
All right. I'm inclined to say no, because at the moment there's not actually any real way to say that it has achieved anything. Because the only kind of racing at that level we've seen with the strict kind of looking at the data in terms of that on Zwift would be the Restart series. We've not had anything other than test events that Zwift have put on with this hardware. We've not really seen an out-and-out race with these athletes on this equipment at that sort of level that's come under kind of heavy verification of the data. So I think we're not going to find that out until we get stuck into the Zwift games in the first few races to actually determine if the trainers are performing better.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see. And your series, which, like I said, it was the spotlight was on you because all the racers were there. And it was, that was also one of the positive byproducts, is that you were able to put on a series. The racers were really hungry to get involved. I want to know, what was your vision for the series, and how did you shape that vision through aspects like the invitational structure, the race length, and the format?
I started planning and kind of spoke about and half announced the race series about a week or 2 weeks before they actually paused the ZWS. So that was honestly a pure coincidence that it coincided with that. And it did help, like you say, it helped me attract more people, but it did also give people an outlet for elite racing where the new verification was placed, weigh-ins and all that stuff. So it was actually a very happy surprise. And obviously it wasn't nice that racing got paused, but at least it gave us something to focus on through that time. My vision for it was just to bring back that team focus. Like I spoke about earlier, it was to have something that you could show up with 2, 3, 4, 5 members of your team, and you could try and get in a breakaway. You could try and actually win a team competition. I'm a firm believer that breakaways, they're one of the most exciting, they are the most exciting part of racing outdoors. And I know esports, indoor cycling is a completely separate sport, but it doesn't mean that we can't share some things with outdoor racing. And I'm a big fan of encourage breakaways. So longer races, harder courses, and having teammates there so that you can try and control the bunch and control who gets in the breakaway and things like that. So I wanted to bring that level of kind of racing back that was fun to watch and fun to be a part of for the racers. But another big thing for me was kind of having equal kind of length races and equal point structures for both men and women. I wanted the ladies to be racing the same length of race as the men, and to feel the race was exactly equal. And I wanted to showcase the ladies racing just as much as the men's was. So we put in like a 10-minute stagger between the two races starting. And the theory behind that was the men will finish and we'll get like the last 25 to 30 minutes purely on focusing on the ladies racing. So I was trying to deliver a few things with the race, and I think we were successful in most of what we were trying to do with it. And it gave people that outlet that we're looking for. So if anything, I'd like to see a bit more participation numbers there, not just to get the overall numbers higher, but it would have been good to see teams kind of commit maybe 4 or 5 riders. So we could have had a bit more team battles going on there. But I think as a foundation race series and my first time doing it, it worked out quite well and we delivered on what I'd hoped.
Yeah, I think so too. I think people are still under the impression that cycling esports is just an FTP contest, and it's really not. It should have all the strategy that a normal road race should. There's so much misunderstanding about what cycling esports really is. And if you actually watch a race, it's like watching a race on the road. So I can see how that really met your expectations and goals. I'm curious, how did you pick which platform you were going to host your series on?
I did look at Training Peaks Virtual, or formerly Indie Velo. I've been involved with Indie Velo since it kind of first come to the fore, and I've been in there a long time, helping George by riding on it and reporting back bugs and feature requests, things like that. But the teams weren't established on there. We didn't have enough riders on there at that time to it didn't have the critical mass there for me to say, look, we're going to host it on that platform. Everyone's there. Let's just race there instead. A lot of the teams I was kind of vouching this to weren't already on that platform. And it was the exact same story with My Whoosh. A lot of these teams, they maybe have one or two racers that are racing in Sunday Race Club and such things, but they don't have their teams established on those other platforms like they do on Zwift. And a lot of the teams we invited, they've existed for a lot of years. So like my team, they've existed for 4, 5, 6, 7 years. And that's all been established on Zwift. Their core lies on Zwift. So to me, it was the obvious place to host it. And James Bailey at Zwift was extremely helpful to me. He's always been really nice to me. So as soon as I kind of broached the subject with him, he was like, well, very helpful with setting up races and kind of assisting me. That was one area that I was kind of worried about, is getting the races set up and getting them managed properly, but they were super helpful. So I was just kind of aligned that way. It made more sense for the teams I was wanting to invite. I got the backup and the help from Zwift as well. So that's why I ended up on there.
The racing was incredible, and the distances were phenomenal, and it really did create something that was a step apart in terms of that. The broadcast was also great, and I have to do a huge shout out to Damon at ZMS Esports Studios for putting that together, because he does top-notch productions. He really is great, and I have to say also, it is so sad to hear he's stepping away from cycling esports, but brilliant that he is busy with other stuff. You must have been really pleased with the broadcast, Dean.
It was, to say it went above my expectations would be an understatement. I've watched Damon's streams, and I've been a friend of Damon's for many years now at this point. I speak to him most days on my own stream. He comes in and he's always chatting to me. He's a good guy. When he was showing me the kind of previews prior to us going live with the first race, I was blown away at like how much time and effort he'd put into matching my event branding and the race book and all the little attention to detail, like the stuff he'd went into. I was kind of blown away with how good it was. And throughout the series, we've had nothing but positive feedback about the way the broadcast has been run. I honestly, I'm kind of blown away with how well all that went and how professional it looked. I thought we could do a good job, but I think what we delivered kind of set a new bar, if I'm being honest, on what a bunch of people in the community can essentially deliver without money, production people, or all those things that we associate with a professional broadcast being put into the mix. I think we delivered something that sets a new bar on what community people can do if they put the time to it.
Yeah, he and ZMS Esports Studios are going to be well and truly missed, I think, from the product broadcast of racing. A big shame, but he's done an amazing job. Let's talk about the future. What about viewership and how you go about improving what is already working really well? But you did there talk about, the community involvement in terms of putting that broadcast together. How do we move forward from there in terms of broadcasting, getting people to watch bike racing around maybe, whether it's another Restart Elite Invitational or whether it's future events that you put on?
Yeah, so I've always been a big fan, like growing viewership wise, getting more people involved in it. It's, I think, showcasing the riders a bit more. So actually, there's a lot of riders that are streaming their performances. There's a lot of riders with big social media presence, and there's a lot of characters behind the avatar. So I think what you guys are doing here, you try and bring the avatar to life. Essentially, that is a big part of it. Make these people seem human. Everybody that's racing at this level is just like you and I. They're like all the people that are going to listen to them, like all the people that watch it and ride on Zwift. And so bringing the people, the superstars of the sport, or the top teams of the sport, engaging them more in the broadcasting and showcasing them a bit more, I think will lead to more people involving their time to watch it. They'll establish more of a following of the riders, of their teams, almost creating fans to a certain extent. And doing it that way, I think that's a good way of doing it. Another way is, you've seen the Zwift Academy, those episodes are dropping now on YouTube, and that's a perfect example of it, because you get to know the people, where they came from, how they got there, and you're seeing their progress. We essentially need to do the same thing, but people that are riding indoors. Showcase them a bit more, show where they came from, show their progress over the years, what they've been capable of. And I think that social interaction with the riders will actually engage people more. As well as bringing in other exciting things like breakaways to the races, I think can only help. They've tried things before, like funky race formats, Point Hunter, and all these short kind of format races. And I'm not a big believer that they will bring much viewership back. I think if you overcomplicate it like that, unless you've got heavy stats on the screen, heavy overlays showing you pinpoint accuracy on data, timings, gaps, points, all this sort of stuff. Unless they can deliver that through APIs and throw that on the broadcast, I don't think these funky race formats are really going to work. And so if they can develop things that would allow them to do that, then I think that is an avenue they could go down to increase viewership on esports. But at the minute, with the lack of on-screen information, it's kind of hard to track what is actually happening in races. And it kind of helps that perception that it is just an FTP test as well, like you mentioned earlier. You just see people going hard all the time and then easing off. And it just almost seems like power tests at times. So if you could bring in some more overlays with better data showing points, time gaps and things like that, I think that would greatly help the viewership grow because the interaction would be higher.
It's interesting that you say that because I basically founded this communique on giving a face and personality to the avatar. And I love the GCN episodes of the Zwift Academy. It's really great. You all said to us just a moment ago that the pausing of the Zwift World Series was kind of a pleasant surprise because it allowed you to really showcase what you were doing. But it also must have kind of made you pause and say, if they can't put on a verifiable race, then how am I going to do it? How did you approach that philosophically? I know that you had a race control team. Who was on that team with you? How did you choose that team? And then how did you then decide amongst yourselves how you were going to approach that?
Yeah, so on the race control team with me was Leah Cuthbertson. She's coached by Alex and she's also on my team. And I obviously straight away thought, we can't have two people from Restart doing the verification on the Restart series that we're both racing in. So I asked Alice Lethbridge to get involved as a kind of almost like an independent commissaire or part of the race control team who was like an independent and neutral source on things. She wasn't racing it. She's not on the team. And I knew she has really good knowledge and she's really hardline on her opinions of data and transparency and stuff. So I thought she was the perfect candidate to kind of be the neutral voice. I just didn't want it to seem like I was making decisions based on my opinion that were not fact checked or not double checked or by someone that was kind of truly neutral and independent on it. So that was the kind of the makeup of the race control that I come up with. And I never received any negative opinion or negative outlook on that at all. All I seen was people being quite positive and accepting of that, and they thought it was a good setup. So I think it worked. I think that was okay. In future, I would probably like to make it even more independent in terms of people that are not racing the series and are not part of a team that's in it. Because I think to have true verification, you kind of have to have people that are independent of the platform, of the team, and of the riders racing. But that would be a future development, a path to go down. And in terms of why we thought, we did look at ZWS and we're like, is it right that we are going to have people racing on the same hardware that currently pausing because of? And I took the decision on it to open up the hardware spectrum a bit more and allow trainers that aren't allowed in elite competition held under Zwift or even my Whoosh rule sets. Because in my opinion, the 1% rule that we have on the hardware it's utter nonsense, to be quite honest with you. This plus or minus 1% being the benchmark for hardware to get into the elite racing, it is nothing more than a marketing slogan that the manufacturers have stuck on the side of trainer boxes. It's a fact it just doesn't exist. So I thought we're very likely to come up against the issues that we're seeing in ZWS with the hardware. It's very likely to happen. So my approach was that we'll speak to the riders in question and just treat them like humans, look at data with them and actually speak and interact with them and their team managers and go over each one on a case-by-case basis. And I knew that we would come up across things, but I didn't want it to essentially mean that we paused our series and didn't have it as well. I thought we had to have something. And I just thought that more human touch, that more human approach, speaking to teams and managers, educating riders primarily, and actually getting to the bottom of why they had these hardware issues, it would help educate and achieve a better standard by default just within riders in this community. Rather than it just being like strict rule sets, you're annulled, you're out of the competition, stuff like that. I wanted to try and educate riders and actually make them understand a bit more about why the hardware was doing that and why they're seeing these problems. So that was the key reason we kind of kept it going and we decided to go with it. We thought we'd speak to riders a bit more and actually try and help them out rather than just annulling them.
Do you think that that's maybe a shortcoming of the performance verification that's utilized by Zwift. You think there should be more of a gray area there to acknowledging the fact that the hardware isn't perfect? Maybe we can just meet in the middle somewhere.
Yeah, and I think that's the hard part. It's really difficult to determine that, because if you use dual recording, for example, you've got a rider that posts up a 6% difference in their dual recording and they get annulled for that in one race. In the next race, you see someone else with a 7% difference in their dual recording and they're not annulled for it. People see things like that. They see the percent differences. They look at a dual recording and they're like, oh, well, why did he get annulled and that other person didn't? And that grey area just expands and expands and expands. And it just keeps going like that until you have to set limits on things. And a lot of context is lost there because there's a lot more data verification than just looking at percentage differences. But this is what the top level figures people see. So I just think the wider you make that grey area, the more leeway there is for not annulling results. But there's also that potential more toxicity involved in the community of people questioning decisions that are made and both not made. So there has to be limits put in there somewhere. You have to set a limit somewhere so that if it goes beyond that, it's strict. But below that, you've still got enough grey area to operate within. It's so hard. And I totally sympathize with Zwift and ISIC and the guys that are trying to meet these new rule sets and manage that, because it is almost an impossible task.
I certainly agree. And I know that we're critical at times, but I know that they have a very difficult job to do. I would just like to see the pendulum swing slightly back in the rider's favor. And I think that may have happened with the way that things are going now. But I want to move on to another aspect of your series that I think was quite unique, is the weigh-in procedure that you used. I know that you have pretty strong opinions about why you chose that procedure and the weight cutting issue that's seen as an accepted part of our sport. So maybe you can give us your take on that whole aspect of elite racing, that may be something that's kind of like behind the scenes that we don't really see what could potentially be the detrimental impacts of that.
Yeah, weigh-ins are something that are always going to drive big debate. There's people on all sides of many fences with it. The 12-hour window for me, though, was mostly to accommodate people. It's the human aspect of it. The races were on a Saturday, so I was like, people have got kids, people are getting out of bed at different times, people have got work, people have got other commitments. It's their weekend. So we want to have a weigh-in window there, but we don't want to discourage people from racing purely because of a weigh-in window. So there were so many problems to try and cater for with a weigh-in window, and it was impossible to keep everyone happy. So 12 hours is what I settled on. It was more so about giving people the same kind of window to weigh in, not in terms of the hours involved, but in terms of when they could perform the weigh-in. So my thinking was, if I get out of bed at 7 a.m. in the UK, I'm 8 hours before race start time. I get out of bed, I do my weight. A lot of people do their weight when they get out of bed in the morning. Cyclists or not cyclists, it's just kind of something people do. It's the most natural way to check your weight is in the morning when you get out of bed, I think. North Americans could be getting out of bed at 9 a.m., 2 hours before the race. They could weigh in straight out of bed as well. Same with Europe. And I was just trying to cover as much of the globe as I could with this possibility of getting out of their bed and weighing in. And it kind of levels that playing field a bit more. Everyone can get out of bed and weigh in at the same time prior to racing, whether it's 6, 7, 8 or 9 hours before or 2 hours before. So it was purely more of a logistics thing and making it more viable to athletes. And I was also aware that we had some people that I wanted to greatly encourage this, actually, was people that hadn't done weigh-ins and dual recordings and all this strict stuff with races before. I wanted to enable them to kind of try it, test it out, see how they got on with it, and make sure they see it's not as elite or as off-putting as what it might seem from the outside. So give them a chance to do a weigh-in and dual record and submit their data. So I was wanting to try and encourage those kind of people, not discourage them because it was too strict. And that was another reason for deciding on the 12 hours. And I believe it worked. You know, I mean, I had a few complaints initially saying that people won't be racing at the weight they're racing at. And then my argument to that was, well, people can cut their weight and they're not racing at the weight they're racing at if they weigh in 2 hours before the race. We're doing races that are potentially 1.5 hours long. You could start the race at 70 kilos, and by the time you finish, you could be 68.5 kilos. So even when you're on the bike, you're not at the weight you weighed in at all, ever. So I'm like, again, you've got to draw that line somewhere. And I think in terms of remote competition, I think the 2 hour weigh-in window is good. I think the 1 hour weigh-in window that we now have in Zwift Games, I can see why they've done it. but I can also see why it could be problematic to a lot of people. The 12-hour window, I think, is decent, but it is also open to manipulation. And in short, what I'm saying is I don't think there is a window that is acceptable or perfect for all manners of racing that we can just apply. In-person events like we saw at the World Championships, I think they missed a massive opportunity there to set a standard and weigh people before they went and started their warm-ups. I think you had all the athletes in one place, all their trainers set up. They should have had 2 sets of scales there that were calibrated and tested and checked, 2 officials there, and had the riders walking up, weighing in before they went to their bikes. And I think that if you can set up a conference center in Abu Dhabi with all this equipment, all this screens and all these people in place, I think they could have set that up and actually made a point there of doing it that way. But that's very different from competing at home, shall we say, where you've got to try and accommodate athletes and their lives. So yeah, it's a tough one. You'll never get it right.
It's a really interesting discussion that will rumble, won't it? One of the things listening, Dean, you're talking about verification, the difference in dual records, the difference in terms of times for weigh-ins, and the human approach. It's almost like there's an educational piece that is missing. You buy your turbo trainer, you're a fit person, so you start racing. You get to that entry to elite, and then no one tells you everything. Or, there's an assumption you have knowledge, and an assumption you know about discrepancies between dual record, an assumption that you know about these things and what to look for and what not to look for, and then how to fix it if you've got a problem. And there's a big piece of knowledge there and an educational piece that I think is, and listening to you makes me think is really missing.
No, honestly, I couldn't agree more with that. And that's another thing that I tried to deliver with the series, is that every team had a team manager, and they were the single point of contact for all riders on their team. And what I did was I tried to arm all those team managers with a guide on setting up their verification platform login, a guide on the weigh-in video with example videos, and just doing things like that, communicating with the team manager and letting them communicate that to the athletes, whether it be on their Discord or their Microsoft Teams or Facebook Messenger, whatever they use, deliver that to all the team that are involved and try and collaborate with them and educate them a bit more. I've always said it for years now that a lot of the buck needs to stop with the teams. If you have riders on your team representing your team, I think they should be educated to a standard that allows them to kind of race at the level they're racing at. And it's always bewildered me, in all honesty, that we see people at ZRL Premier League or Zwift Grand Prix or Zwift Games, these things, and they're almost like dual recording is like an alien subject to them. They still don't really understand what they're doing with it. And to me, that's like, there should be team managers, there should be structure within your team, if you're at that level, to educate your riders on this stuff. A lot of people have come on to Restart for that very reason. They've been able to compete at elite level on a team but none of the people round about them have raced at elite level really understand it. And they've ended up coming looking for an elite level team, as they'll call it, because they're looking for that guidance and that help and that education. And that's just something that I've spent years doing since the ZRL Premier Division days. Is I've basically handheld people through all this stuff, because I understand not everyone's technically minded or really good with all the tech side of stuff or understanding protocols. So I've always just made a habit of keeping up to date with it and helping people through it and making sure it's as crystal clear as possible for them and how to do that. And then, like I say, that was a big part of the Restart series for me, is let's use this as an education and as a trial almost for people and their teams to get used to this sort of stuff, so they've experienced it and they know what to do. And through that, we build a better standard of competition, hardware, and understanding of it amongst the athletes by default by doing that.
Let's shift gears to another leadership role you've taken on, and I'm really excited. Not that I wasn't to talk about the Restart, but I'm really excited to talk about this one, Dean. The formation of the Cycling Esports Riders Union. How did that idea come about, and how did you get involved in the leadership level of it?
Well, it come off the back of, we're all part of a group called the FERA, the Fair E-Racing Alliance. And FERA pretty much exists to educate team managers and team members on data and hardware and protocols, things like that. And off of the back of that, we've always had these discussions that it kind of ties into what I've just said there. Like, a lot of athletes might be on teams that they don't have that manager structure in place, that management structure there to go to them and get help with things. And it shouldn't really actually be totally dependent on a team. So what happens if we had like a rider association that athletes are a member of? You can have athletes on any team in the world, but they can still be a member of this athlete association and feel like they have representation in the sport. with their problems or with their suggestions and their opinions. And that's independent of platform. It's for the sport. I'm a big believer that we need to start seeing this as a sport and not as one platform or the other. It has to be seen as an actual sport. And if we establish that within the communities, I think that'll be a big step forward for us all, rather than it being picking and choosing. But the Rider Association would represent athletes across any platform if they're a member of the sport. They just need to sign up to it. So that's the general consensus of it. The main thing is to protect the well-being of athletes. So if we use the recent examples of people being annulled because of things it's not their fault, potentially, or if you have people being challenged and asked to do steps in the verification that they think's not right, they could come and ask the Athlete Association for help with that. Do you think this is just? Do you think this is right? And I think it just, in terms of well-being for the athletes in the sport, I think it would give them something extra that they feel represented by, that they've got knowledgeable people there with experience of all the stuff we're talking about here to help them and enable them to progress in the sport. So I think it would be very valuable to people. And I think because it's not team dependent and athletes can just join it regardless of what team they're on, it kind of gives it a bit more scope to move forward as well. As to why I've ended up in you call it the leadership team, but I think essentially what it'll be is a bunch of people are going to set up as interim leaders in this, and it will have to be a kind of democratic process to say, we think this person is the right person to take it forward. And I think that'll be based on how people have demonstrated themselves within the community and within the sport, as to who riders and teams feel is the most kind of viable people for those positions. So again, it just comes down to, I made my opinions clear and I've said enough and I've been involved enough that it's just naturally and organically meant that we're kind of going forward with it. And it's just this select group of people that's happened that way. It's not like it's been selective or elitist or that. It's just the people that have put the time to it and actually allocated energy to try and drive it forward. And that's how it's came about to get to the point that it's at now.
This is something new then that really is just getting off the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. We've had 2 meetings with the UCI as it stands, and we're trying to set up meetings with the platforms at the minute. Because the idea is that we're going to heavily, obviously, collaborate on this with the UCI. We want to be aligned with the UCI and their visions for the way that the sport's going to go. But we also want to be aligned with all the platforms that are going to host racing on it. We want to be aligned with them so that we can drive it as sport, as I say. And the next step on that, again, will be to align with national federations as well, which will arguably be the biggest challenge, because some national federations that we've seen are super committed and quite happy to be involved with this sport. Other national federations are very reluctant and actually giving it no time whatsoever. So it's a lot of bridges that we're going to have to cross, and some of them will be a lot easier to cross than others with the national federations. But getting all these key stakeholders and all the people that are required to grow the sport involved from this early stage, I think is quite important. But it is very much in its infancy. We've only had 2 meetings with the UCI, but it's been very positive to begin with, and it's looking like it's definitely a path worth travelling.
If any of our listeners, the elite racers or other riders who are listening to this and think this sounds actually really exciting, it's something I would really like to be involved in or help shape, who else is involved in organising the union, and how do riders who want to get involved?
Well, at the minute, we don't really have a means of riders getting involved. Essentially, we have a discussion platform on Discord. That's all it is at the minute, plus the meetings that we're having. And that's kind of something that we're going to have to develop as we go. So I think the next step would be to try voluntarily also put it out there so that people can voluntarily come to us and actually say, I want to be a part of this. It sounds good. So this is the first step, is kind of just saying that this exists. This is what we're trying to do. And hope that key members of the communities, regardless of where they're from or what teams they're from, come forward and say, yeah, I want to be a part of that. It sounds like a good idea and it sounds like the right thing to do. From that, we can then start involving riders and getting them involved in the discussions as well. But it's kind of, it's almost like it's a mammoth task just getting this thing off the ground, because you're trying to involve so many people, but at the same time not try to involve everyone at the same time, because then there's just too many voices to shape the foundations of it. So it's something that we've not addressed yet. We're not at the point of, but it's something we hope to get to very soon, is actually getting the riders involved and feeling like they have some voices there to speak on their behalf. So if anyone listening to this does want to get involved and it sounds good, absolutely come and speak to us. In terms of who's involved with it, Aaron Borrell, who you've just mentioned earlier on, he's been involved in it. Alice Lethbridge, Luciano has been giving us some of his time as well. And Johannes Kilding, who's just become the Swedish esports champion, actually. He's quite extensively heading it up as well. He's been putting a lot of time into it. So yeah, come and speak to us. Speak to teams that might know us and stuff. We're happy to speak to anyone about it and their ideas for it and getting involved.
You know, you talk about professionalization. Every professional sport has a union, an organization that looks out for the best interests of the athletes. And I've said it on this podcast several times. The athletes are the least represented stakeholders in our sport right now. They have no say in what goes on the platforms. They have very little say in what goes on at the UCI and at the National Federation. So moving that forward with the Riders Union is a great idea. Getting riders involved in it is probably a really good idea also. All right, Dean, you've been so generous with your time here, and we've gone so deep into these topics. So I want to give you a couple topics and get a quick rapid fire reaction from you. There's a big debate in the cycling esports space now about athletes putting up World Tour power numbers. What do you say to yourself when you see an athlete exceeding World Tour power numbers? And does an athlete have to have outdoor results in order to be considered legitimate indoors?
What do I think? Straight away, I think people jump to too many conclusions straight away without looking at the data, and they should do that. It's kind of toxic to do that. Do I think people need to have outdoor data? I don't think they need it, but I think if you're posting up numbers after 1.5 hours of racing that's higher than what we're seeing World Tour pros doing out in the roads, I think at a bare minimum you could be doing a lab test or going out to try and do some outdoor efforts to try and at least validate what you're doing. I think people should put a bit more effort into validating their performances indoors at that level.
Yeah, it's interesting to say that because Zwift actually added the clause into their new rule set that allows for lab testing. So I have a feeling that that's going to be something that is becoming more and more prominent in our sport. And I for one, certainly support that. Definitely. Okay, next one. We've seen a lot of social media stuff with esports athletes putting up these tremendous performances. One being your team member, Ewan Mackey, who, first of all, if you don't know his story, you should. He's 6'7". He did weigh 21 stone at one point, and now he's putting up these incredible numbers. But he almost broke the kilowatt minute, right? He almost did 1,000 watts for a minute. And that created a major stir on social media, even World Tour pro sprinters calling him out on it, which prompted you to say, we can absolutely appreciate that seeing these numbers with no context is questionable, and we actually encourage such things to be questioned, but the bandwagon dismissal is painful. What did you mean by that? And do you think it's good for the sport that certainly lacking understanding to begin with, to have these almost freakish performances being out there and going viral and having the last time I checked, there was 500 comments. And, let's be honest, the very large majority were calling him out as a cheater and all kinds of other nasty things.
Yeah, it's the Ewan one was a very strange situation for me because I'm not used to getting that much attention or interaction with things on social media. So I was kind of blown away with that. But it's exactly on that point I just said previously that people jump to conclusions and call foul before they even know any context. And I suppose when you're putting yourself out there on Instagram, that's a separate kind of world from our little esports bubble that we're in, where people kind of understand performance and the hardware that we're on. So too many people jump to conclusions and call foul on things without even any context. And that kind of, I don't like that. It's very toxic. I don't know. There's probably 100 comments on there telling him to calibrate his trainer or his power meter. And the guy's on a kicker bike. And I'm like, you literally cannot calibrate a kicker bike. They're factory calibrated. You cannot calibrate the thing. And it's like to like myself and Ewan and people in the esports community, that's common knowledge. But to all these people commenting on Instagram, they're all just jumping saying the same thing. And it's like, well, that makes no sense. So it's about finding a way of showing a bit more context to that. Showing so you mentioned there Ewan's story about the weight he used to be and what he is now and things like that. You've seen his story. 99% of people commenting on there haven't seen that. So it's about bridging that gap and showing that context on things. I will say, I'm going to go outdoors riding with Ewan. He's only an hour and a half south of me. I've met Ewan in real life. He's the tallest guy I've ever met. It doesn't come across in that video. I've had a few people say he looks like he's 60 kilograms. He is, honestly, I will get a picture of this guy. I will put it on social media. He is enormous. I pinned his number on at a race once. And honestly, I was like arms up here, pinning his number on. He is that big. You will not believe it. When you see me stood next to him, he is unbelievably tall. So he is a unit of a guy. And when you put that in the context of he done a warm-up, He done a 1 minute fresh effort, just full gas, 1 minute effort, and then stopped. And that's the watts he was achieved. And it was 970 watts, I think he did. And people are telling me it's off the Coggin chart, it's impossible. And I'm like, there's guys out there that have done 12, 13 watts per kilo and nobody said a word for 1 minute. And this was barely touching 11 watts per kilo. It's not actually as insane as people are making out. They just see that 1,000 watts and they jump to this conclusion. So we'll get outdoors and we'll do some riding outdoors. And I'm more interested to see what he can do outside. Get him smashing up some climbs for 1 minute. And I think we could have some fun with it and not troll the people on Instagram. I don't want to do that and create some negative reaction, but just validate him a bit, show what the guy has been working towards and what he's actually been doing. And I think it'll be some good fun for us, and it'll be good to kind of validate that he is capable of doing what he's been doing on his trainer.
Well, can I just say, one of the things that has been really interesting since it all happened is the number of people trying to replicate it. I have heard, and so many people say to me, oh, I had a go. I went to see how long I could hold 1,000 watts for. I mean, honestly, including some riders who I know don't race, but took on the challenge anyway.
So that's good. It's good fun. People have been trying it again. We saw Hayden Pucker try it. But one example I was showing people is pre-COVID, there was a guy in England called Callum Brown, and he was an absolutely phenomenal hill climber. And the British hill climbing culture is pretty extensive. It's existed for a long time, and it's a really fun, a really great community. I absolutely love it. Especially north of England, Emma will know that the hill climbing community is exceptional. And Callum Brown, this guy, I've spoken to him a few times. I was right into my hill climbing prior to COVID, and he does not look like a hill climber by any stretch of the imagination. He looks like a bodybuilder. He's a massive guy. He weighs less than Ewan, and he was doing near 1,100 watts for over a minute. He was reckoning he was on his way to 1,100 watts. He was doing well over 1,000 watts for a minute, smashing up British hill climbs and winning them on multiple power meters. And it was just amazing to see. And I've been using it as an example to go back to people. It's not as ridiculous as it seems. This guy weighed a lot less than Ewan. He trained for that effort, and that's what he was doing. So I think it's good to see people are trying to do it and seeing how long they can hold 1,000 watts for. I think that's good fun, and I think that's something, it's probably the only positive I've heard come off the back of Ewan's Instagram video. So we'll take it.
I would say there's probably plenty of positive that's come off of it. And before Emma asks you our wrap-up question here, you mentioned Hayden, and a similar thing happened when he broke 500 watts during that echelon race, and it certainly raised a lot of eyebrows with people. I just hope that we get to the point, just for professionalization's sake, where the athletes that are actually engaging in the sport, the actual elite athletes that have vested interests in this, actually just get to the point where they can just be happy for each other when they put up a huge performance, rather than having to question everything that goes on.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with that. It's almost at the point now where you see someone on your team or you see yourself doing a good performance, and your first reaction is to think, oh, are people going to think that's legitimate? I done it yesterday. I done my best 5 second ever in my power passport test on whoosh. And my first reaction to my coach, Alex, was, oh, I dual recorded it. Here's the dual record, and look at the data. It is what it says it is. My first reaction was to think, well, what are people going to think of that? I think we need to get away from that and let people just perform and do what they do. And I think to get there, we have to have a lot more reliance on the equipment. I think that is the root cause of a lot of this, is people do not trust the equipment. It's not that they're calling people cheaters. I think it's that you can't trust that performance. It was done on that trainer, or it was done on that power meter. That can't be right. And until you get away from that, I don't think we're ever going to be able to just trust a performance on face value with little to no context.
Well, Dean, first of all, I'm going to say congratulations on your 5 second power PB. Good job. Well done.
Thank you.
Great to hear. Second, I'm going to say thank you ever so much for your honest and passionate perspective today. It's been really, really interesting chatting to you. So thank you very much for being here. But I do want to wrap up with one final question, if that's okay. Where would you, Dean, like to see cycling esports in 5 years' time? And what one thing do you think is the most crucial to get us there?
I would like to establish a properly governed sport. So not fully under the UCI. I would like to see us have a kind of overarching governing body that could have us rankings and leagues, prizes, and a race calendar across the multiple platforms. So I'd like to see it established as a sport, not an activity per platform. I'd like to see it established as an actual sport, so that we could have a race calendar that spans the year. You could know what races are coming up in October and November, and you know what sanctions, what level of racing that will be, what verification will be in place, and it all comes under the umbrella of a governing body, or essentially an organisation that owns that. And I think that is more critical than Olympic inclusion and full alignment to the UCI. I think there's scope there for a governing body to step in and actually own the cycling esports space that way, and give us a more kind of structured seasons and rankings and leagues for people. So I'd like to see that established in the next 5 years. And what I think will take to get that there is essentially people working together. We've got a lot of people with a lot of good knowledge and a lot of good information, a lot of good experience in this sport. And I just feel that they need to come together a bit more. And it's something we've always tried to do, is get people to collaborate and come together. And I think if we do that with the right people involved in the mix, it will happen and it can happen. So yeah, just everyone be a bit nice and just get working together and let's make it happen.
I think that's a lovely place to stop. Thank you ever so much, Dean, for joining us today. It's been really, really great chatting to you.
No, thanks very much for taking the time to speak to me. I do massively appreciate it. And it's been good fun.
So just before we
Dean.
finish,
Thanks.
however, just before we finish, I am going to ask Chris a little question, because my spies have been out and I have been reading pop-up articles from a certain Chris Schwenker on the Escape Collective. Chris, what are you up to?
I'm actually extremely proud of being able to announce this now. I have been a member of the Escape Collective from the moment I could. I was a huge supporter of Wade Wallace and Kaylee Fretz when they were at Cycling Tips. And then I don't know if anyone that's listening knows their story, but eventually they were purchased by Outside. And they grew very disenchanted by the way that cycling media was going. And what I mean by that is paid media being forced to write about topics that they didn't want to write about for SEO purposes or to appease sponsors. When they couldn't take it anymore, they decided to create their own platform, which they called the Escape Collective, and it's based upon a membership model. So they're fully independent. I know that some people don't think that I am, but I've always stressed the independence. And it's very difficult in the esports space because all the platforms have their own paid media sources. They all have their own podcasts. They're all controlling the narrative, and getting the actual insider information on that is very difficult. But I've been given a lot of independence and the freedom to create a vertical for cycling esports at the Escape Collective and become an esports reporter, which I'm pretty sure is the first one in the history of mainstream cycling media. And it's a distinction that I certainly don't take lightly. And I'm going to use it as an opportunity to educate and raise the knowledge level that we've discussed on this podcast episode about 10 times, and also to expose a new audience to cycling esports. And I really hope that it works out. It's been a little bit rocky in the beginning. The traditional audience is a bit difficult to kind of sell cycling esports to, but the guys there and the team at Escape are behind me every step of the way, and they know that this is the right thing to do for cycling and for cycling esports. And I have to just basically thank them for taking a risk on me and letting me use it as a platform for my writing and for cycling esports itself.
Well, Chris, anything that gets cycling esports out to the masses is absolutely brilliant, and congratulations on the job with Escape Collective. It's fabulous to hear. Number one in the world, first cycling esports journalist for Escape Collective, Chris Schwenker. Yay! Well, you can indeed subscribe to the Virtual Velo Podcast on your favourite podcast provider and, of course, on YouTube. You can follow me, Emma Martin, on Instagram at biking_Emma, and Chris at the Zwift. You can catch me putting words to the action on the Sunday Race Club on my whoosh this Sunday and every Sunday. And let's not forget, March sees us go into Ramadan, so the times change. The first broadcast, the women are away 3:30 p.m. GMT. Really changes things up around the globe. It's going to be really interesting to see who's on that start line. You can also head over to thezwift.com and please become a member of the Escape Collective to join in the conversation and support independent cycling esports journalism. We will have more interesting guests from the world of cycling esports joining us, including cycling influencer, coach and nutrition consultant Kate McLeod. She's up next. UAE Team Emirates and esports cycling star Michael Vink will also be with us in March. Thank you ever so much if you are waiting for the show. We will be with you shortly. Thank you to Dean for sharing his insights. It was really great to chat. Thank you for listening. We will be back. Chris will tell you to take care of your heart. I will tell you to stay safe and enjoy your cycling. We'll see you again soon. Goodbye.